A trusted law of orbital physics stopped being useful the moment humanity finally looked closely at Saturn. In 1980, as the first images from Voyager 1 began arriving from deep space, scientists saw something moving across Saturn's rings that should not have been physically possible. Massive black wedges, thousands of miles long. Dark radial structures stretched outward across the brightest part of the ring system like giant shadows burned directly into the ice. But the shape was not what created the crisis. It was the movement. Because every particle inside Saturn's rings was supposed to orbit independently. That was one of the safest assumptions in planetary science. Instead, entire sections of the ring were suddenly behaving as if millions of separate particles had fused together and started rotating like one single solid object. And in one photograph, one of the most trusted rules governing orbital motion quietly stopped working. The image itself looked simple. Bright white rings wrapping perfectly around Saturn. Then giant dark spokes sliding unnaturally across the surface. Frozen in formation. Holding shape far longer than physics allowed. Scientists at NASA immediately understood the problem. Saturn's rings were not solid. They were made of billions of separate ice particles. Tiny fragments. Loose debris. Each one orbiting Saturn independently under gravity alone. And gravity creates a strict rule. Particles closer to the planet orbit faster. Particles farther away orbit slower. This differential motion should immediately tear apart any large visible structure. Nothing inside the rings should stay connected. Nothing should move together. Certainly not something thousands of miles wide. But those black spokes did exactly that. And suddenly, the image was no longer just strange. It had become dangerous. Because if those structures were real, one of the oldest assumptions used to explain planetary rings had just failed. For decades before Voyager arrived, Saturn's rings have been treated as one of the cleanest gravitational laboratories in the solar system. Astronomers believe they understood them almost perfectly. No atmosphere. No weather. No geological activity. Just ice fragments obeying gravity. A nearly perfect mechanical system. That confidence disappeared the moment the spokes appeared. At first, researchers considered the safest explanation. Perhaps the dark wedges were simply shadows. Maybe some unseen moon passing nearby had cast temporary darkness across the rings. But the geometry failed immediately. The shadows moved. Not randomly. Not drifting with normal orbital speed. They rotated in patterns inconsistent with every known object in the Saturn system. And worse, some spokes appeared to maintain rigid alignment while traveling through regions where orbital speeds should have been radically different. The first explanation collapsed, and the image itself started meaning something new. This was no longer an unusual photograph. It was evidence that independent ring particles were somehow behaving collectively. Millions of separate objects were acting as one structure. And gravity alone had no mechanism to make that happen. Then scientists began examining multiple images. The spokes kept returning. Different positions. Different sizes. Different angles. But always the same impossible geometry. Dark wedges sweeping like giant blades across the bright white ring system. The more images researchers studied, the less the anomaly resembled an optical illusion. And that changed the meaning of the observation again. At first, the spokes looked like a visual oddity. Now they looked like a system-level failure. because the rings themselves were violating their own physics. And if Saturn's rings could do this, then every model used to explain how planetary rings evolved over time suddenly became questionable. That single image had become much larger than Saturn. Then came a second problem. Scientists on Earth tried to verify what Voyager had seen. Powerful observatories pointed toward Saturn. Years passed. Nothing. The spokes disappeared completely. No telescope could find them. No repeated observation confirmed them. The anomaly simply vanished. And suddenly, the earlier images became even more disturbing. Because now researchers had evidence of a phenomenon that appeared and disappeared without warning. Not permanent structures. Temporary structures. Something inside Saturn's rings was turning the anomaly on and off. But nobody understood what controlled it. That missing trigger became the next crisis. For years, planetary scientists had believed Saturn's rings were governed almost entirely by gravity and collisions. Ice particles crashed together. Momentum distributed naturally. Orbital mechanics maintained structure. It was a stable system. Predictable. ... Mathematically reliable. But if some invisible process could suddenly force ring particles to organize themselves into massive moving structures, then gravity was no longer the only controlling force. Something hidden had entered the equation. And scientists had no measurement for it. The dark spokes returned to scientific papers again and again. Every image from Voyager was reanalyzed. Researchers studied particle density, orbital resonance, micrometeor impacts, magnetic field models. Nothing worked. Every explanation failed somewhere. And with every failed explanation, the original image changed meaning. Those dark wedges were no longer unexplained structures. They had become proof of missing physics. Then the story became larger than Saturn itself. Because planetary rings exist around multiple worlds, Jupiter has rings. Uranus has rings. Neptune has rings. And scientists had spent decades modeling ring behavior using the assumption that gravity dominated everything. Now Saturn was showing direct evidence that another force might reorganize matter inside an entire planetary ring system. And if the models were incomplete here, they could be incomplete everywhere. One photograph had become a threat to an entire category of planetary science. Then came the waiting. For over 20 years, no spacecraft returned close enough to investigate. The anomaly remained unresolved. A scientific wound left open. Telescopes on Earth continued watching. Still nothing. No consistent observations. No repeat confirmation. The spokes had effectively disappeared from human view. And the longer they stayed absent, the stranger Voyager's images became. Because science had encountered a visible phenomenon it could neither explain nor reliably observe again, the safest assumption had become uncertainty. Then in 2004, everything changed. Cassini-Huygens arrived at Saturn. For the first time in decades, humanity had returned. Its cameras turned toward the rings. And almost immediately, the dark spokes appeared again. Exactly where they should not exist. Again, massive black wedges spread across the bright white ring system. Again, millions of particles appeared to move together. Again, gravity failed to explain what humans were seeing. But this time, scientists had better instruments. Long-term observation. continuous monitoring. And finally, a pattern emerged. The spokes were not random. They correlated with Saturn's seasonal position relative to the Sun. Solar radiation levels changed electrical conditions inside the rings. Tiny dust particles were becoming electrically charged. And suddenly, the invisible force revealed itself. Electromagnetism. The ice particles were not simply orbiting under gravity. Charged dust was lifting above the ring plane. Magnetic forces were temporarily organizing fine particles into enormous visible structures. The spokes were never solid objects. They were electromagnetic disturbances spreading across billions of orbiting particles. And this changed everything. Because for generations, scientists treated planetary rings as gravitational systems. Simple orbital mechanics. Predictable motion. Stable equations. But Saturn had quietly exposed a missing layer. Gravity was not enough. Invisible electromagnetic forces could reorganize matter on planetary scales. And that opening image from Voyager now meant something far more important than anyone realized in 1980. Those giant black wedges moving unnaturally across Saturn's rings were never just strange formations. They were evidence that an entire planetary system was being controlled by forces scientists had forgotten to include. For decades, one of the cleanest mechanical systems in the solar system had been secretly running under hidden physics. And one trusted law stopped being enough. The rings never changed. Human understanding did. Gravity was only part of the story.